Welcome to the debate. Have you ever, looked across a table at a friend you've known for a decade, someone who knows your history, your family, all your deepest secrets, and suddenly realized that you just have absolutely nothing in common with them anymore?
Yes. It's honestly one of the most uniquely jarring experiences a human being can have. The sudden, deafening silence where there used to be this effortless shorthand between you two.
Exactly. And it rarely happens overnight, right? It's usually this quiet, slow-moving tectonic shift.
Yeah, it's profoundly painful. And today, we are focusing our discourse squarely on that exact reality, like the fading, fracturing, and sometimes complete disappearance of people from our lives when we undergo a period of significant personal transformation.
Right. But we aren't just looking at the basic psychology of outgrowing a social circle. We are examining this specifically through the lens of vibrational alignment.
Which is a very specific and I think very fascinating framework.
It really is. The material we are diving into today posits that this loss of relationships, this fading away of old friends, is actually not a sign of personal failure.
Right, it's not a tragic social fracture.
No. Instead, it is presented as the ultimate proof that manifestation and the intensive inner work you are doing is actually succeeding.
And, the source text draws really heavily on the teachings of Bashar.
Right, the channeled entity.
Yeah, a prominent entity in New Age philosophy known for detailing the mechanics of reality creation. And the author applies these metaphysical concepts to a very grounded, very modern scenario.
Because they write about their own visceral transition out of the high-stress, survival-based world of corporate finance and insurance.
Yes, into what they call conscious wealth building. And the core thesis they arrive at fundamentally reframes the painful fading of friendships as alignment in motion.
Alignment in motion. It's a stunning phrase.
It is. But we have to acknowledge right out of the gate that it opens up a massive philosophical divide. Like, if you're listening to this right now and you've recently been on the receiving end of a friend leveling up and, slowly ghosting you.
Oh, sure.
Hearing it described as the universe's mechanics of success might sound incredibly hollow or even offensive, honestly.
And that tension is precisely why we're here today. So to lay out where we stand, my position is that the disappearance of relationships during profound personal growth is a necessary, healthy, and inevitable mechanic of frequency alignment.
Okay, and I'll be pushing back on that.
Right, because from my view, it is a literal shifting of one's energetic signal that organically and entirely neutrally filters out misaligned connections to make room for true resonance. It's not a moral or emotional failing on anyone's part. It is just a structural reality of how human energy operates.
And I approach this from a very different angle. I absolutely acknowledge the reality that relationships naturally evolve and sometimes dissolve as we grow, but applying strict vibrational determinism to human bonds is super risky.
Risky in what way?
Well, specifically using financial frameworks to explain the end of friendships as our source material does. It risks reducing intimate human connections to, transactional assets. So I will argue that using the language of spiritual alignment can sometimes function as a highly sophisticated shield.
A shield against what?
Against the messy, uncomfortable, but entirely necessary friction of human growth. It allows us to avoid the hard work.
I hear the emotional weight of your concern, I really do. But I think to truly evaluate this, we have to start by understanding the literal mechanics the author is proposing. The fundamental premise drawn from the source is that frequency determines every single person in your reality.
Right.
And we need to be very clear here. In this framework, this isn't just a poetic metaphor. It is an objective mechanic.
Yeah, it's treated as a law of physics for the metaphysical world.
Exactly. When an individual commits to doing the inner work, when they are actively shifting limiting beliefs, heavily regulating their nervous system, and changing their daily practices, their fundamental frequency literally changes.
Which the text says prompts the quiet dissolving of relationships.
Yes. And that dissolving is not abandonment. Just as a new radio frequency cannot physically pick up old stations, A new vibrational state cannot sustain relationships that were entirely built on older, perhaps more limited versions of the self.
The radio dial has moved.
Exactly. And this removes the heavy, agonizing burden of guilt. It frames the departure of friends not as a personal failing, but as a mechanical certainty.
Look, I understand the elegance of that logic. It's very clean. But we have to look at the underlying commodification woven into it.
Commodification?
Yes, I don't deny the reality that growth changes our social circles, but I firmly challenge the specific framework used to explain and justify it here. The source material relies heavily on highly clinical concepts.
Well, the author has a finance background.
Right, and it specifically compares human beings to financial assets undergoing a portfolio rebalancing. When we start doing that, we fundamentally commodify human connection. Furthermore, attributing the fading of a deep 10-year friendship to an expired vibrational agreement strikes me as a profound form of spiritual bypassing.
Okay, wait, how so? Walk me through the mechanics of that bypass as you see it.
Well, because it allows an individual to actively withdraw from a relationship, which, by the way, the source explicitly admits to doing.
They decided to stop reaching out?
Exactly. They state they decided to stop reaching out while passively blaming the invisible mechanics of the universe. It provides a highly convenient, spiritually sanctioned exit strategy from the complex work of actually navigating relational friction.
To really unpack that divergence in our perspectives, we have to look closely at Bashar's radio frequency analogy. It is the foundational mechanic of this whole philosophy. Let's explain how this actually works for everyone listening.
Okay, go ahead.
The concept is that you are constantly broadcasting a signal, and that signal is not just what you say, it is an amalgamation of your subconscious beliefs, your baseline emotional state, and your dominant thoughts.
And that signal naturally attracts a match.
Yes, mathematically, it attracts a vibrational match. And that is what I find most powerful about this analogy. Its insistence on the absolute neutrality of the process.
The text emphasizes that this is happening constantly whether you are aware of it or not.
Yes. The source explicitly states that this attraction is not conscious, not deliberate, but vibrational. Think about the highly specific example the author provides about their past career.
The corporate insurance job?
Right. They describe vibrating at a frequency of obligation, survival, and quiet resentment while working in that world. So what did that specific signal attract? Mechanically, it attracted colleagues who bonded over those exact same frequencies.
Shared complaints.
Exactly. They bonded over long hours, office politics, complaining about management, mutual exhaustion. That was a perfect vibrational match.
I agree that misery loves company, and shared trauma or shared exhaustion is a powerful bonding agent in corporate environments.
Right. But what happens when the author's internal frequency shifts? They do the work. They start shifting toward consciousness, abundance, and building a life on their own terms.
So the dial moves.
When that happens, the old connections inevitably have to fade because the radio dial has moved. The old station, the station broadcasting that we are all exhausted and trapped, is no longer being tuned into.
Sure.
We aren't just talking about meditating differently here. We are talking about the mundane reality where one friend is now exploring expansive, limitless ways of generating income and finding joy.
And the other friend just wants to sit at the bar and complain about their boss over $4 beers.
Exactly. The language has entirely changed. How could one possibly maintain a genuine connection when the foundational language between two people is completely gone? Isn't it far more harmful and completely exhausting to force a radio to somehow play two entirely different frequencies at the exact same time?
I hear that, I really do, but I just don't buy that it is purely a mechanical, invisible force at work.
Why not?
Because, well, I understand the radio analogy. It's neat, it's clean, and it conveniently removes all the messiness of human emotion. But my primary issue is that it strips agency from the individuals involved.
In what way does it strip agency?
It paints a picture of us as passive receivers simply turning dials. But if we look closely at the text, there is a crucial, incredibly telling admission. The author notes, and I quote, "Some of those disappearances were mutual. I stopped reaching out as much. I stopped initiating conversations."
Right. The behavior changed to match the frequency.
But that behavior right there reveals that it isn't just an invisible frequency doing the heavy lifting. It is an active, conscious human choice to stop engaging.
Well,
By labeling this conscious withdrawal as discernment, or describing it as energy seeking its own level, the framework provides a highly convenient, guilt-free exit from relationships that might simply require a little more effort or an uncomfortable conversation to sustain. We are effectively rebranding ghosting or distancing as honoring our transformation.
wait, hold on. I think you are reversing the causality there. The choice to stop reaching out is prompted by the intense discomfort of the mismatched frequency. It is an effect, not the primary cause.
Is it though?
Yes. Think of it like this. If you touch a hot stove, you actively choose to pull your hand away, right? But you do it because the mechanics of heat transfer are literally burning you. The choice to stop reaching out to a friend who is constantly draining your energy is just the behavioral manifestation of a frequency mismatch.
Okay, but the human heart is not a hot stove. And human beings are not radio stations. I think we need a different analogy here.
Let's hear it.
Let's look at a relationship like two climbers roped together on a mountain.
Okay.
Your position and the source material's position is essentially saying that if one climber suddenly gets a burst of energy or finds a better technique and wants to climb faster, the fact that the other climber is struggling means their frequencies no longer match.
Yes, the momentum has shifted.
Right. And therefore, the fastest, most aligned thing to do is to just cut the rope. But isn't the whole point of being roped together to help pull the other person up? Or at least to secure them while they find their footing?
That is a beautiful analogy. It really is. But let's follow it through to its logical conclusion. What if the second climber doesn't want to climb the mountain at all?
What do you mean?
What if their entire identity is wrapped up in sitting at base camp and complaining about the cold? If you are roped to someone who is actively refusing to climb and you try to pull them up against their will, you don't save them.
Well,
You just drag them over the rocks and eventually their dead weight pulls you right off the cliff. This goes exactly to the concept of shared limitation, which the text uses to describe these older bonds.
okay, let's talk about that term, shared limitation. It's incredibly loaded. Is the concept of a shared limitation always a negative thing?
How could a shared limitation be positive?
Might what the source disparagingly calls a shared limitation sometimes just be the reality of enduring human loyalty during difficult seasons? Are we pathologizing the simple act of struggling alongside someone?
I don't believe the source is disparaging loyalty at all. I think it is differentiating between a bond built on genuine resonance, which has the elasticity to stretch and evolve when one person struggles, and a bond built solely on an agreement not to grow.
Give me an example of a bond built solely on an agreement not to grow.
Think about those colleagues in the insurance firm we talked about earlier.
Okay,
If the entirety of your relationship consists of meeting at the water cooler to complain about how unfair the management is, how impossible the quotas are, and how miserable life is, the entire architecture of that friendship is supported by the pillars of powerlessness and victimhood.
sure, bonding over a bad job.
Right. So if one person decides to heal, to expand, to read a book on conscious wealth, and suddenly says, actually, I think I'm going to start my own firm and take control of my life, the foundation of the relationship evaporates.
Because the shared complaint is gone.
Exactly. The water cooler conversations stop making sense. The author explicitly says, this doesn't mean the other person is bad or wrong. It just means the vibrational agreement, that contract to be miserable together, has dissolved. It is an act of extreme clarity to recognize that, rather than dragging a decaying dynamic out for years just to prove you are a loyal friend.
I can concede that clarity in that specific corporate scenario is valuable, but the clarity described in the text is achieved through a remarkably clinical detachment.
Clinical doesn't mean bad.
Well, it brings us perfectly to the specific practical analogy the source uses to justify releasing these connections, the financial strategy of portfolio rebalancing.
This is definitely the most controversial part of the text, but in my view, also the most structurally sound.
Structurally sound. The author leverages their background in finance to suggest that as we move from one season of wealth building or life building to another, the assets that serve the previous season may not be right for the next.
Yes, exactly.
They explicitly compare human relationships to investments in a portfolio that needs to be liquidated or shifted.
And I think we should fully embrace that financial analogy. When a person's investment goals evolve, say, moving from high-risk growth stocks in their 20s to stable dividends in their 50s, a smart investor doesn't hold on to misaligned assets out of nostalgia.
But we are talking about people, not stocks.
Let me finish the thought. They don't keep a failing stock out of a fear of the empty space it will leave in their spreadsheet. They honor the asset's past contribution. They recognize it got them to where they are, and they rebalance. I want to vigorously defend the clinical nature of this analogy because its clinical nature is precisely its greatest strength.
Wait, really? You think applying a spreadsheet mentality to human friendship is a strength?
When it comes to the crippling psychology of outgrowing people, yes, absolutely. Viewing relationships this way systematically removes the heavy, paralyzing emotional guilt that plagues people during periods of massive personal growth.
Guilt is sometimes just a sign of a conscience.
But think about the agonizing internal monologue people go through. Did I do something wrong? Am I a bad person for not wanting to spend my Friday nights with them anymore? Am I abandoning my roots?
Those are valid questions.
But the financial analogy replaces all of that toxic guilt with structural clarity and grace. It is not malicious to say, this relationship was a perfect match for who I was, but it does not match who I am becoming. It removes the ego. It just looks at the math of the energy.
Let's put the listener in the shoes of the discarded friend for a second, though. If you are listening to this and your best friend of 10 years suddenly decides they are on a higher frequency.
That's not the phrasing they'd use to their face.
Maybe not, but if they view you as a high-risk stock that no longer fits their spiritual portfolio, you are going to be gutted. The text itself anticipates my exact critique here.
It does.
The author writes, I know that might sound clinical for something as intimate and emotional as human connection, and they are absolutely right to worry about that, because treating human beings like assets to be liquidated when they no longer serve our current season of manifestation is fundamentally utilitarian.
It's not utilitarian. It is.
It is. It reduces a complex living person's value to their immediate utility in your personal growth journey.
I have to challenge that interpretation. You are conflating utilitarianism with energetic hygiene. The source isn't saying you extract value from people like a vampire and discard them when they are dry.
It sounds a lot like it.
It's saying you recognize when a co-creation has naturally concluded. It's an acknowledgement of natural cycles.
But look at the language the author chose. A smart investor does not hold on to misaligned assets. Relationships that are built on the genuine resonance that the text claims to praise often survive precisely because people do not treat each other like disposable assets when their frequencies temporarily clash.
Well,
real friendship, deep human bonding is forged in the fire of those mismatches. Let's go back to the mechanics for a second. If my friend goes through a profound transformation, maybe they start a new business, maybe they find a new spiritual path, and suddenly we are on completely different wavelengths.
right.
Does a smart investor approach me and I am liquidated from their life because my ROI is temporarily low? Does this transactional worldview completely preclude the unconditional support required for deep, lasting human bonds? If we apply a financial lens to love and friendship, we lose the very essence of what makes those things sacred.
Look, I hear the emotional weight of your argument, but I think you are misinterpreting the application of the analogy. The text makes a very clear, vital distinction between relationships of genuine resonance, which do survive because they have the fundamental flexibility to adapt, and relationships of shared limitation, which do not.
Okay, so you're saying the portfolio analogy only applies to some friends?
That portfolio rebalancing analogy specifically applies to the latter. You aren't liquidating a deeply resonant, unconditional bond. If a friendship has unconditional love at its core, that love is the highest frequency there is, and it will effortlessly bridge the gap of changing careers or hobbies.
But how do you know the difference in the moment when you're in the thick of a disagreement?
Because of how the relationship asks you to behave. You are rebalancing away from a connection that was entirely dependent on a version of you that literally no longer exists. If a relationship requires you to remain small, exhausted, cynical, or miserable just to maintain common ground with the other person, Keeping it is not an act of noble loyalty. It's an act of self-sabotage.
Self-sabotage.
Yes. And that self-sabotage comes with a massive energetic cost. You are basically keeping a toxic asset in your portfolio that is dragging down the performance of your entire life.
But who decides what constitutes remaining small? This is the danger of the framework right here. It is entirely subjective. What one person calls vibrational alignment, another might call developing a massive superiority complex.
Oh, come on.
I'm serious. I worry deeply that this framework encourages people to view any relational friction, any disagreement, or any difference in life goals as a mismatched frequency that requires liquidation rather than an opportunity for mutual understanding.
That's a misreading of the intent.
Is it? If your friend says, hey, I think your new focus on conscious wealth building is making you a bit self-centered, is that friend exhibiting a shared limitation, or are they providing the vital grounding truth that true friends are supposed to provide?
That is a fair distinction to draw. But the text isn't talking about constructive criticism from a loving peer. It's talking about a fundamental divergence in life trajectories, which honestly naturally leads us to explore the immediate aftermath described in the source.
The empty space.
Yes, the period following this rebalancing, because the author doesn't pretend this is easy. When these misaligned connections fade, the text acknowledges that it leaves behind deep loneliness and a massive empty space. I want to thoroughly explore this concept of the transition.
The space between the old life and the new life.
Exactly. The loneliness felt in the middle of a genuine frequency shift is not a destination. It is the sacred space between who you were and who you are becoming.
Right.
The source shares an incredibly poignant story of a client who was building her first real investment portfolio and leaving a corporate job that had cost her everything: her health, her peace of mind. As she stepped into this new empowered identity, she was genuinely grieving the quiet friendships and the social world she had built inside the older, disempowered version of herself.
And the text notes that she was asking, is it supposed to feel this lonely?
Yes. And the brutal, honest answer is yes, because she was in the middle of a rebalance. To use the financial metaphor, her energetic portfolio was temporarily holding less to make room for what was coming.
She was in cash, essentially?
Exactly. It was mostly in cash, so to speak. This space is highly uncomfortable, but it is pure, sacred potential. The text warns against the deeply human impulse to close that gap by shrinking back.
Shrinking back.
The temptation when you feel that loneliness is to tone down your growth, to make yourself smaller, less successful, less radiant, just to become familiar again to an old friend and keep a fading connection alive. Framing this through the financial lens once more, shrinking back is the most expensive energetic trade one can possibly make.
Why is it the most expensive?
Because it costs you twice. You give up the empowered self you have worked so hard to become, and simultaneously, you fundamentally fail to gain the aligned reality that is waiting for you on the other side of the empty space.
You lose both lives.
Yes, you sacrifice your expansion for the illusion of security. You buy back the toxic asset just because you don't like looking at an empty line on your spreadsheet.
I understand the allure of romanticizing this isolation. Calling it the universe clearing the channels sounds much more profound and heroic than admitting you were sitting alone in your apartment on a Friday night because you alienated all your friends with your new lifestyle.
That's a little harsh.
But I have to question whether this sacred space is sometimes just the natural, highly predictable consequence of abandoning one's support network. When you radically change your life, when you quit your job, start a business, or dive into intensive inner work, you need grounding more than ever.
But if your grounding is attached to a life you are trying to leave, it's not grounding, it's an anchor.
Let me push back on that. Let's really scrutinize the idea that trying to bridge the gap with an old friend is inherently shrinking back or contracting your frequency. Why is the assumption embedded in this framework that connecting with someone different from you requires you to shrink?
Because you have to lower your vibration to match theirs.
But why can't you maintain your high frequency while sitting across the table from someone who is struggling?
Because, mechanically speaking, if the only foundation of the bond was a shared limitation, The only way to re-engage with the bond is to re-engage with the limitation.
I disagree.
Think about it. If the only thing you ever talked about was how much you hate your industry, and you no longer hate your industry, what do you talk about? If you bring up your joy, it triggers their lack. If they bring up their misery, it drains your joy.
I challenge that premise entirely. Maintaining connection with people who aren't on the exact same conscious wealth-building path, who aren't vibrating at your newly discovered frequency of abundance, isn't necessarily liquidating a high-performing asset.
Then what is it?
It might actually be the hallmark of a well-rounded, grounded, emotionally mature human being. We do not require an echo chamber of identical frequencies to thrive. Let me pose a question to you and to the framework.
Okay.
If we only surround ourselves with perfect vibrational matches, are we actually growing? Or are we just insulating ourselves from the diverse perspectives, the complex realities, and the very friction that causes true, robust intellectual and emotional growth?
I see what you're saying, but
If you only hang out with people who agree that wealth is conscious and manifestation is real, you aren't enlightened, you're just in a bubble.
I understand the fear of the echo chamber, but let me give you a different perspective on what a vibrational match actually means in this context. A perfect vibrational match does not mean an identical clone who agrees with everything you say.
Okay?
It doesn't mean you all read the same books or vote the same way. It means someone who matches your current level of expansion, your baseline curiosity, and your willingness to take responsibility for your own life.
So it's a match of intent rather than a match of identical traits?
Exactly. A vibrational match can provide immense intellectual friction and challenge. They can disagree with you vehemently, but they do it from a place of mutual empowerment rather than mutual limitation.
They challenge you to be better.
Yes, they challenge you to be better, not to stay small. The text is not advocating for a sterile echo chamber. It is advocating for a reality where your core connections reflect your highest intentions rather than your outdated fears. Shrinking back isn't about compromising on a debate topic or humoring a friend's different hobby. It's about pretending you don't believe in your own worth just to make someone else's insecurity comfortable.
But the line between honoring my worth and dismissing people who don't fit my new lifestyle can become dangerously thin. We really have to look at the socioeconomic reality of the specific transition the author describes here.
The transition from corporate to conscious wealth.
Yes, moving from a standard corporate insurance job to conscious wealth building often carries distinct class markers, different disposable incomes, and wildly divergent daily schedules.
Well, sure.
The fading of friends might not just be a mystical, metaphysical frequency change. It might be the deeply mundane reality of changing class markers.
I don't think it's fair to reduce it just to that.
Hear me out. If you suddenly have the freedom to work from a laptop in Bali and go to $1,000 wellness retreats, and your old friends are still clocking in at 8 a.m. and drinking $4 beers on a Friday to cope with their boss, the relationship fractures because the material reality of your lives is now incompatible.
Right, the external circumstances have shifted.
Exactly. And labeling that purely as a vibrational shift glosses over the very real structural reasons why those relationships are breaking down. It sounds a lot better to say our frequencies diverged than to say I have money and free time now and they don't, so we have nothing to talk about.
I don't believe the source ignores that material reality at all. In fact, it acknowledges the external shifts, the new schedule, the new financial strategy, the new boundaries.
But it blames the frequency.
It emphasizes that the internal shift, the frequency, is the true driver of those external changes. The external changes in income or lifestyle are merely the outward manifestation of the internal frequency of abundance.
Okay, that's a very new age way to view income inequality, but let's move on.
Well, this brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial point of contention: the practical application of all this philosophy. If we accept that these relationships are fading, how does the source advise we navigate the actual messy dissolution of these bonds?
This is where the text gets highly prescriptive.
Yes, and beautifully so. The text champions a very specific practical method for moving forward, releasing the connection with gratitude rather than resentment.
The internal mantra? Correct.
The practice is to say internally, "Thank you for the season you gave me. I release you with love." I find this incredibly profound from a cognitive behavioral standpoint.
How so?
It recognizes that every person in your life served a purpose perfectly, exactly as they were, for a specific season of your development. It allows for a completely clean break without the heavy energetic residue of regret.
Or guilt.
Right. Or the toxic, ego-driven narrative of who failed whom. It honors the fact that both individuals are on their own valid path of expansion, even if those paths are now permanently diverging.
I see.
In my view, this is not clinical detachment. This is the ultimate act of intellectual charity and love. You are not holding them hostage to your new expectations, and you are not holding yourself hostage to their old ones.
Okay, I will certainly acknowledge that gratitude is a much healthier emotion than resentment. Moving forward without bitterness is universally good advice, whether you are following Bashar or a standard therapist.
Exactly.
However, I must deeply question the unilateral finality of "I release you."
What is dangerous about releasing someone who no longer fits in your life?
Because while this internal mantra sounds incredibly peaceful, it is entirely one-sided. It neatly packages the other person as a completed season in the protagonist's narrative.
But it's an internal.
It takes a complex, continuous, living human being with their own internal world and reduces them into a supporting character whose contract has simply expired on your personal television show.
That seems like an overly cynical reading of an inward practice designed purely to cultivate internal peace. You aren't saying it to their face to diminish them. You are saying it to your own nervous system to let go.
It might sound cynical, but I think it points to a massive structural flaw in the entire philosophy. You are dealing with them as a finished chapter in a book, rather than a living person who might also be growing, just at a different pace or in a different direction.
But if the direction doesn't match,
you are finalizing their role in your life based on a snapshot of their current frequency. Furthermore, the text promises that trusting this empty space will yield connections that are more aligned, more nourishing.
Which it will.
But if we accept this premise, does it not set up an endless, exhausting cycle of discarding and acquiring relationships the exact moment they become challenging?
No, because friction isn't always a sign of a mismatch.
But the framework makes it so easy to confuse the two. If every time a relationship feels unaligned, heavy, or difficult, we simply close our eyes and say, "Thank you for the season, I release you," aren't we just endlessly chasing the next perfect vibrational match?
I really don't think that's the intention.
We risk becoming relational consumers. We start treating human beings like iPhones, constantly upgrading to the newest model of friendship that perfectly mirrors our current optimized self and throwing the old one in a drawer.
Let's dissect the logic of that because I think it ignores a critical caveat in the text. The source explicitly distinguishes between genuine resonance and shared limitation.
We talked about that.
And relationships built on genuine resonance survive these frequency shifts. They stretch, they adapt, they endure the friction you're talking about. The releasing practice is specifically prescribed for relationships that have demonstrably run their course.
Because they were anchored in a shared limitation.
Exactly. It is not advocating for running away at the first sign of a disagreement. It is advocating for radical, unflinching honesty when a connection genuinely has nothing left to stand on.
But again, that honesty is defined solely by the person leaving.
And who else should define the boundaries of someone's life? Let's be intellectually honest ourselves here. Holding on to a dead connection out of a misguided sense of obligation or societal expectation serves absolutely no one.
But
it drains you and it patronizes them. Releasing someone with love, even unilaterally, allows them the freedom to go find the people who genuinely match their current frequency too. It clears their channel as much as it clears yours. It is an act of mutual liberation.
Mutual liberation assumes a mutual desire to part ways, which is almost never the reality on the ground. Often one person is left entirely bewildered, wondering why their friend suddenly views them as an expired asset or a lower frequency.
But again, you don't say that to them.
I think true intellectual charity requires us to look at how this specific framework might be weaponized by the human ego.
Weaponized how? The text is about inner alignment, not outward domination.
The ego loves to be told that its isolation is actually a sign of spiritual superiority. Think about how seductive this narrative is to someone who might just be, honestly, a bad friend.
A bad friend?
Yeah, I'm not lonely, and I'm not bad at maintaining friendships. I am simply vibrating at a frequency far too high for the mundane people around me.
Oh, wow.
That narrative is a bulletproof vest for the ego. It protects the individual from the painful, vulnerable work of asking, did I show up for them? Was I a good friend during my transition, or was I so obsessed with my own conscious wealth building that I completely abandoned the people who cared about me?
I think you are identifying a genuine human pitfall, but I also think that is exactly why the source stresses that this phenomena is not about someone being bad, wrong, or limited in an objective sense.
They do say that.
The author explicitly says not because the other person is bad or wrong, but because the vibrational agreement that created the connection no longer exists. The text itself strips away the superiority complex by insisting that every single person is on their own perfectly valid path of expansion.
But the language implies a hierarchy.
If a reader misinterprets that text to fuel their own narcissism, that is a misapplication of the tool, not a fundamental flaw in the mechanics of vibrational alignment. A hammer can build a house or break a window, right? You don't blame the hammer.
But a framework must be judged, at least in part, by how easily it lends itself to such misapplication. When the entirety of the terminology relies on raising your vibration or leveling up your life, the implicit spatial metaphor is vertical.
Meaning,
You are moving up, they are staying down. Despite the author's best efforts to neutralize the language and say no one is wrong, the inherent hierarchy of phrases like conscious wealth building versus the frequency of survival and obligation, it inevitably, unavoidably creates a value judgment.
well, one feels better than the other.
Exactly. One is framed as the goal, the other is framed as the limitation to be escaped.
It is only a value judgment if you view survival and obligation as a permanent moral failing, rather than what the text suggests it is, which is a temporary energetic state of being.
A temporary state?
Yes. The text views it purely as a state that one can choose to transition out of when they are ready. And if someone chooses to remain there for whatever reason, that is their sovereign prerogative. Releasing them with love is the ultimate acknowledgement of their autonomy.
Or the ultimate dismissal.
Let's synthesize our positions as we draw toward the conclusion of this incredibly dense discourse. My position remains that the structural reality of frequency shifts demands that we allow misaligned relationships to organically fade.
And you think this is loving?
Doing so with gratitude and treating it as a natural, mathematically necessary rebalancing is not callous or utilitarian. It is, in fact, the most loving way to honor our own hard-won growth and to clear the energetic channel for true resonance to arrive. It is a profound mechanism of the universe that protects both parties from the exhaustion and resentment of forced alignment.
And my synthesized position is this. While personal evolution naturally and inevitably shifts the landscape of our social circles, adopting a framework that strictly equates human bonds to radio frequencies and financial assets risks cultivating a deeply clinical, utilitarian detachment from humanity.
True. Robust growth might sometimes require doing the difficult, messy, unglamorous work of staying connected across different frequencies, rather than simply releasing people the moment the foundational agreement feels outdated. We must be incredibly careful not to let the pursuit of perfect vibrational alignment insulate us from the beautiful friction of complex human connection.
I think where we absolutely find a solid point of convergence today is in the acknowledgement that profound personal transformation inevitably and fundamentally disrupts the status quo of our social lives.
Oh, entirely.
There is no version of massive internal growth, whether financial, spiritual, or psychological, that leaves the external world untouched. You cannot change the core without the surface rearranging itself.
I agree completely. We are entirely aligned on that reality. And I think we also converge on the belief that navigating this immense disruption without resentment, without bitterness, and without casting blame is absolutely crucial for long-term peace of mind.
Yes.
That holds true regardless of whether you view that peace through the esoteric lens of energetic frequency or the grounded lens of simple emotional maturity.
Exactly. It reflects the incredibly intricate balance between honoring one's own transformation and honoring the complex humanity of those who walk beside us, even if they only walk beside us for a brief season.
A brief season, yeah.
I think examining how we categorize the people in our own lives, whether we view them as lifelong, adaptable resonances or as beautifully completed seasons, is a remarkably rich area for further exploration within this material.
It challenges us to look very closely at our own motives when we walk away. Are we releasing someone because the connection is truly fundamentally expired, or are we simply afraid of the vulnerability and friction required to maintain it?
Right.
There it is, a question no channeled entity and no financial analogy can answer for you. It is a question only the individual can answer for themselves in the quiet of their own conscience.
A profound question indeed, and exactly the kind of friction that creates growth. We leave you, the listener, to weigh the precise, elegant mechanics of vibrational alignment against the enduring, messy complexities of human connection.
Beautifully said.
The laws of physics, the mechanics of energy, the math of a portfolio. These things are simple, predictable, and clean. But the human heart, caught in the immense gravity of its own transformation, will always be a beautifully murky landscape to navigate. Thank you for joining us.